All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to tonight's program. It's very exciting. Tonight, we're going to learn a little bit more about seabirds and the Seabird Protection Network and the rocks that they depend on for their breeding. And before we get started, I just wanted to invite you all while we wait for, I think there'll be a few more people signing on. Couple little Zoom etiquette things. Be sure to mute yourself when you're not talking. We'll have time for questions at the end. And you can either use your video or not. We also, I encourage you to use the chat function if you'd like to put in there, maybe introduce yourself in one thing, one reason why you're here tonight. That'll kind of help our speaker understand where everybody's coming from. So I'm Carol Vandermeer, and I work at the Trinidad Coastal Land Trust and have been working with the Seabird Protection Network since 2016. And this is a really great collaboration between the Bureau of Land Management, the Trinidad Coastal Land Trust, also the now Cal Poly Humboldt, formerly HSU, in helping us better understand and monitor the breeding populations of seabirds off our coast, as well as monitoring some of those pinnipeds out there. And so tonight is really a general talk to kind of introduce you to the amazing world of seabirds and pinnipeds, but we will also be sharing with you a little bit about how you might choose to get involved in being one of our community scientist volunteers. So I'm going to share my screen in a moment and have just a couple of things before I introduce our speaker tonight. So yes, thanks for sharing some of those thoughts in the chat. Feel free to share why you're here tonight. So hang on a minute. So as I mentioned, to make sure you're on the right airplane. So tonight's our webinar, and it just goes from 6 to 7. We'll try to leave some time for questions at the end about the ecology of seabirds and how you can help in their conservation. But before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge that the coastline and the land we live by, study, and enjoy in the Trinidad area is a southern reach of unceded ancestral and present homelands of the Yurok people, including the Yurok tribe, Trinidad Rancheria, Big Lagoon Rancheria, and Resegini Rancheria, as well as any non-federally recognized groups that identify as such. This is a place where language, culture, history, and the future are strongly tied to ocean, land, and wildlife. This acknowledgement is just one piece of our education and conservation work in our North Coast community. Many of these groups have great projects and programs involving the ocean and wildlife that can be found on their websites. Hold on. I also wanted to make a couple announcements, and I'll revisit this, that if you do become interested in the Seabird training, after you've listened to tonight's program, you can go online and register for it, and it starts on Tuesday, March 23rd. We have an evening training from 6 to 7:30, and then there's a choice of 2 times for a field training on the 26th or the 27th. And then I didn't list it, but on Wednesday, the 29th is when we train people on how to enter your data into a data portal so that we can analyze the data and better understand what's happening with birds. But the Land Trust also does all kinds of different educational programs, and there is another birding walk coming up. It is a bilingual birding walk, and that's going to be on Sunday, May 22nd from 9 to 11. So check out our website at trinidadcoastallandtrust.org just so that you can see those things. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. And I've had the good fortune of working with Russ. He is a BLM wildlife biologist at the Carrizo Plain National Monument near Bakersfield, California. He has over 25 years of bird identification experience in North and South America. Born and raised in Oregon, he's been a professional pelagic bird guide for Oregon Pelagic Tours since 2007. And with a combined passion for education and nature, he enjoys giving presentations to the public, leading bird tours, and engaging with the general public to stop to look through his spotting scope while he's out in the field. And I certainly have benefited from that as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Russ, who will be going through the talk. And Russ, I presume you want to save questions to the end, or people could put their questions in the chat too. Does that sound good? And you are on mute.
Yeah, I would say put the questions as you think of them in the chat. I think that, and then we can answer them as they go along. But you know, I know that we think of things as we go along immediately when you see or hear something, and so yeah, either write it down or yeah, send it in that chat, and then we'll get to them at the end of the talk. How does that sound?
That sounds great, and I'll keep an eye out too. So, all right, you're on, Russ.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and start this. It's probably going to take a second to get that. Okay, and then I always have to remember where to move myself so that I can see what I am putting down there. So welcome everybody. And the talk is really about seabirds and seabird identification and seabird ecology, seabird biology, all those things wrapped up into one. And I just put this title, Seabirds, you know, think globally, act locally. And here, raise your hand if you know what this bird is. Well, of course, I can't see you raised hand. So this is a black-footed albatross. So good job for those of you that got it. We can see that this is an adult bird that it has retained out of some of its juvenile, these browner feathers here along the edge are these old worn feathers. And so they replace these feathers depending on the bird species on an annual basis, sometimes twice a year, because those feathers are what help them fly, right? And that's part of the reason why we adore and admire birds so much. Black-footed albatross, aptly named. It has black feet. This is, although an adult, it is a younger individual. Older they get, they have more white in the tail and more white in the head. So here's a fuzzy photo of where they breed. And you can see in green that they are on the Hawaiian island chain, the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, not the main islands like Oahu and Maui and Lanai, but they're up in the northwestern island chain, midway. And then there's a small breeding population over off of Japan as well. So as you can see just from the range map, that they cover you know, a vast amount of the Pacific, of the North Pacific Ocean. And so they have a number of traits that help them traverse from you know, coast to coast, essentially. So what's a seabird? A seabird essentially is a bird that spends its life in a marine environment. It has a number of adaptations that help it cope with the marine environment. We can divide those seabirds into nearshore species that feed and also nest along the continental shelf of the continents of the world. And then there are pelagic species. Pelagic means ocean going or seafaring. And these are the true seabirds, if you will, if we were to distinguish, in the sense that, you know, they spend days, if not weeks, out of sight of land, even months. So they are sleeping, eating, living the majority of their lives every year out on the open ocean. So another example, this is a Buller's shearwater. Buller's shearwaters breed on the northern, off the northern island of New Zealand. And you can see that they cross the equator and they show up on our coasts here in California. Mainly in August and September are the primary months to see them from a boat. But you generally you don't see them from shore, but you have to get out on a boat and get 10 miles offshore out near the continental shelf break to see these birds, mainly because of what they feed on. So seabirds generally are long-lived species. They have a high site and mate fidelity, which means that they return to the same place year after year, and they mate with the same partner year after year. They have low reproductive rates. So as you can see, here's a Laysan albatross, and they typically will have one chick. This particular individual is named Wisdom. It was banded as an adult, and since Laysan albatrosses take 5 years to reach adulthood, then we know that she's at least 66 years old. Most birds don't breed until they're 7, 8, 9. So we think that she's a little older. So it's, some sources say that she's 70 and she's still reproducing, which is just fantastic. It's just a great success story. Seabirds typically will nest in dense colonies. You can see that they're spaced evenly just out of pecking distance from their neighbors. And most of the time, these seabirds will only come to nest, only come to land to nest. And so we're talking the time it takes for them to do courtship, lay the egg, have the egg hatch, and then have that hatchling fledge out of the nest. And then they're kind of gone. So that's a 3 or 4 month period where these seabirds are on the rocks on land. And then the other 8 months out of the year, they have this other amazing aspect of their life where they are over the open ocean feeding and doing their daily activities there. So seabirds don't drink fresh water, they drink salt water. And as you can imagine, the blood becomes super salty and they need a way to get rid of that excess salt. So they have these large salt glands that you can see on their forehead, and the blood gets pumped from the heart through the arteries, and it goes up and passes through these salt ducts and then returns to the heart via the veins, right? And as it passes through these nasal salt glands, the salts, through simple diffusion, goes across the membrane and then into this secretory vesicle, and then gets passed out of the naricorn, what we call the nares, or the hole there in the bill. And some birds look like they have a constant runny bill, where there's always a little drip of liquid, and it's that saline solution, that salt that's constantly being taken out of their blood. Other small birds like storm petrels will forcibly kind of blow their nose, if you will, and shoot it out that naricorn. So this is a very busy looking screen of the physiology, but if you focus in the upper right here, where you see, think of when your mom made chocolate chip cookies and she would come into the room and those scent molecules spread into the available space, and pretty soon the whole room was permeated. And it's that spreading out into available space that's going from a high concentration to a low concentration. Think back high school biology. And so the salt in the blood here is going from a high concentration because they're drinking that salt water, and it's going across this membrane, across the cell membrane, from a high concentration to a low concentration, and then it gets passed out of the naricorn or the bill, and it just drips right up the bill there. So some other seabird adaptations is they have strong legs and webbed feet. Some of these species, as we see here, the cormorants will use their feet to swim underwater. And these particular ones, cormorants, are fish eaters, and they have these long necks, and they use it almost like if you were spear fishing, and they kind of coil that neck almost like it's tight, like a rubber band, and then you let it go and it shoots forward and grabs the fish while they're swimming after it. Other birds that are smaller with shorter legs and shorter necks, they use their wings to fly underwater. Another adaptation. These birds tend to be very dense and heavy. It helps them to be less buoyant and to sink and to swim underwater. And then you have birds that aren't going under the water, but they are feeding on the top of the water column. And so they have these long, very long wings where they can soar for hours. One particular adaptation is that the wings are very narrow. And what that does is it requires lots of wind to give them the lift. Unfortunately, if you're out in the open ocean, there's generally a lot of wind. Wind is coming off of the water waves. Wind is being generated from the different currents and gyres and weather systems. So if you think of one of those paper airplanes that you used to make and the ones that were really skinny and looked like a fighter jet, typically you could throw them a long distance, but you need a lot of speed behind them. And what happens is these wings of these organisms are narrow and they need a lot of wind. But generally, fortunately for them, they live in an environment where there is sufficient wind. I point this out because when there's no wind, oftentimes these birds will be sitting on the water and taking brief rests until there is enough wind to fly around and go look for food. The eye shape, obviously the eyes are adapted. They have an extra nictitating membrane, all birds do, but the shape of the eye changes when the birds are underwater so that they can see in a different medium, the water medium versus the air medium. So here's a slide of just some of the various feeding behaviors. We have birds that are diving underwater. We have birds that are diving quite deep underwater. Some of them are just diving just below the surface. Some birds are picking and scavenging right off the surface. Others are waiting for birds to find food, like this Jaeger up here or skua, and it will steal the food in air. Excuse me. We're waiting for the next slide to come here. How about that? Okay. So there are a lot of seabirds out there in the world, but the ones that we're going to focus on for tonight's talk is the birds that can generally be found on the near shore rocks, and therefore we're going to talk about near shore species of seabirds, and they're going to be around Trinidad. And these near shore, remember, they're going to be along the continental shelf, either breeding and or feeding. So we have common Murre, Pigeon Guillemot, black oystercatcher, double-crested cormorant, Brandt's cormorant, pelagic cormorant, and western gull. Oops. So the western gull, Larus occidentalis. Occidentalis, you'll see that word in scientific names. It means to the west or the western front. And this seagull, we don't call them seagulls because what if they flew over the bay? Then there'd be a bay gull. So ooh, we're just going to call them gulls, right? And they all have first names. And this one is western. It's a large pink-legged gull. It has black wingtips. It has that yellow-orange bill. And it truly lives along the western coast of the US, all the way down a little bit into Baja. So it's truly a range-restricted species, western gull. The double-crested cormorant. This is a cormorant of fresh and saline and salty water. It lives and breeds in many different types of habitats. If you go inland to Ohio or Nebraska, you will find these birds. They're ubiquitous throughout the entire US, and even to our northern and southern neighbors. The double crest obviously is why the bird was named. You see on this left-hand side, the crest along the edge. But really what you can, they only have that in the high breeding season. And what really sticks out is the orange gular pouch. And they're related to pelicans, and they have this pouch, and it's a bare skin. And when they get really hot, then they will flutter it, sort of like when you get hot and you kind of start to do this and create a little air. The next species is Brandt's cormorant. Brandt has this cobalt blue gular pouch and these wispy phyllo plumes of feathers that create those white sort of making them look elderly and elegant. This is a species that breeds, is pretty range restricted, and it's similar to the Western gull in that it's just on the west coast of the US. It gets a little further south into Baja and the Sea of Cortez, but it's a range restricted. And you don't see them coming into the bays very often. They're really out on the coastline. The Pelagic Cormorant is the smallest of the three cormorants that we have. They have a bright red face in high breeding plumage, but even more important and obvious are these white flanks. Not quite a rump patch, but these white flanks really stick out at a long distance. They tend to like more of the vertical cliffs to nest on versus the Brandts and the double-crested like more of a flat area to create their nests. So they can occupy the same rock, but avoid competition with each other because they're utilizing different portions of the rock. You can see that the pelagic is also on the west coast of the US, but it goes all the way out the Aleutian Island chain, in Siberia and Kamchatka, and winters down in Japan as well. It's a little bit more cosmopolitan in its range. So here we see some cormorants that are side by side. We can see that this bird has a much smaller head. It's not a juvenile or a young bird. It's a pelagic cormorant versus a Brandt's cormorant. Sitting right next to it is much larger, thicker head, has a creamy throat patch. They only have the cobalt blue in high breeding, but all year long they will have the cream colored throat patch. Here's another Brandt's cormorant, the lower bird. Here we see a pelagic cormorant sitting next to a double-crested cormorant, and at all times of the year, these double-crested have an orange facial skin. And I bring this up because cormorant ID is one of the more difficult things that folks have with the Trinidad Seabirds. The cormorant ID, they're often at a distance and they're black, and you can get to cormorant, but which one is which? So pelagic is the smallest. Double-crested have the orange face, and that's pretty obvious. The Brandt has the cream-colored throat pouch, but it's not obvious, and you need a good look. However, it's larger and thicker-headed than the smaller pelagic. So that will take time and practice. Brown pelicans are pretty obvious and colorful. They breed in Baja, Mexico, and we see them in the summer months. After they have successfully fledged their young, we see them post-breeding dispersal. They come north into Northern California, off of Oregon, Washington, to utilize the upwelling that happens during the summer. And you can see that they are on both sides of Mexico and also both coasts of the US. So we have the subspecies of California brown pelican on the West Coast, a threatened species. Black oystercatcher. There are many oystercatchers worldwide. Ours in the US is called black oystercatcher. They are very vociferous. They're very loud. If they're anywhere around you, you often will be alerted to their presence by hearing them even before you see them. They're another range restricted only on the west coast of the US and Canada, just getting down there into just at the edge of Baja there. They prefer rocky shorelines, so you're not usually going to see them on sandy beaches unless it's courtship and one bird is chasing another around. But when they nest on rocky shorelines and the rocks that are offshore, the sea stacks, and that's also where they feed. Tufted puffin, I always love to put this in because it's one of my favorite species, and I really love tufted puffins. But we used to have tufted puffins in breeding in Humboldt County, breeding specifically at Trinidad, but we no longer do with any consistency. Once in a while, you'll see a bird fly by in springtime, but they are also one of those birds whose range extends over to Japan and the areas in between with the Kamchatka Peninsula out the Aleutian Island chain. Puffins are in the auk or alcid family, and that family evolved right in the middle of the Bering Sea along the Aleutian Island chain. And so you see the greatest diversity and density. It's an example of adaptive radiation, sort of like the Galapagos finches or Darwin's finches that evolved on the various Galapagos islands. So you'll see the highest species diversity in Alaska as far as this family is concerned, the auks or the alcid family. Common murres are related to puffins. They are an alcid. They, like their namesake, they nest in huge numbers, and they have huge population numbers worldwide. You can see that some have dark heads and then some have lighter heads. Those are the winter plumaged birds. And then we also have the young birds don't have fully dark heads. Something neat that happens, one of the adaptations that common murres have, they nest on cliffs, and you can see that it's a piriform or pear-shaped egg where the top is much narrower than the bottom, and that creates the opportunity for the egg to spin in a circle instead of roll just right off the cliff. So if they get spooked or a fox tries to get them and they fly away for some reason and the egg's there, the egg will not necessarily roll right off the ledge, but it will spin in a circle. Hopefully the fox doesn't see it. So you can see that again, they're a cosmopolitan species, common murres across the northern hemisphere in the subarctic zones. Around Trinidad, you have some major rocks: white rock, green rock, flatiron rock, blank rock, and pilot rock have immense colonies of common murres. Green rock alone has about 60,000, flatiron has about 40,000. So between those two rocks of green and flatiron, you're looking at 100,000 birds just off those two rocks. Both of those rocks are visible from Trinidad. Elkhead might be a little closer to green to get better views, but the Pigeon Guillemot is another alcid. Has these neat orange mouth lining, and that matches the foot color in the high breeding season. You can see the little claws on the toes there. That helps them to not slip, and they nest in crevices. And so fairly low down to the water, they will fly up and into the rock where you can't see them. And there's little rock ledges that they will find and lay their eggs on. Their range is, again, you can see a kind of a pattern here of the ranges is between Alaska and Siberia. And again, this Bering Sea, this Aleutian Island chain was the place where this adaptive radiation, where this family originated from. Rhinocerous Auklet, aptly named for the horny keratin-based protuberance coming off that bill. It's made of fingernail-like protein. They get it during the breeding season. The male's horn is larger than the female's, but both of the sexes have it. And then they have those facial plumes. They are large. They're more closely related to puffins than to the murres, but everybody's still in that alcid family. You can also notice, as we went through these photos, the different types of bills, which allows them to avoid competition feeding on the same types of prey. So these rhinoceros auklets are feeding on slightly different type of prey than the common murres and the puffins and the pigeon guillemots. So they'll take slightly different sizes, Once in a while, you'll see it's like right now, the herring are spawning in various spots along the West Coast. And with that plethora of food, everybody's there at the buffet trying to get the same species. And that's where one thing or one situation where they eat the same thing. The Rhinocerous Auklets tend to have more of a spotty distribution, mainly because they dig their burrows and they have rather long burrows, 6 feet underground, and they need a rock that has enough soil on top so that they can dig those long burrows. So they're a little more range restricted, although you can see that they are on both sides of the North Pacific there. Marble Murrelet. In Humboldt County, this is kind of a big deal, as it is elsewhere, but it's a threatened species in the lower 48. It's a very small, think of it like one of those miniature footballs. It has a very short, tiny bill. Its wings beat really fast and they have to continually flap, and it just, they can flap to 70 miles an hour. What's unique, as many of you know, is that this species nests in old growth forests or trees that are at least large enough, that have limbs large enough that they can sort of shimmy into the moss and deposit their egg and then have it not fall off, and that they themselves will fit on the limb. So they need trees with limbs large enough so that they can fit on it and lay their egg. And then they will fly back and forth to the ocean to get fish and then bring it back to the chick. That way. They routinely breed 10 to 20 miles from the ocean. They, again, are range restricted to the west coast of the US and Canada, and you can see that they're more numerous up off of British Columbia and Alaska. So seabirds have significant interactions with the environment. They teach us about things like how is the fishing doing? How is the is the upwelling happening? Is the ocean healthy? Once in a while, we'll see huge die-offs of certain seabird species, and they wash ashore on the beach, and that can tell us maybe something that's up in the food chain, since they are kind of higher on the food chain. That will tell us about the organisms beneath them and how that's doing. Also, if we know where they're feeding or what species it is, we typically know where in the water column and how far out from land they'll be feeding, and we can that will alert us to check those sorts of conditions as well. There we go. So just a quick history about the impacts to seabirds. We had these 4, which had a huge impact. Our egg harvesting back in the day, gill nets and long lining, those are types of fishing, pollution and oil spills, and human disturbance. And so we had massive numbers of egg harvesting, and they still are allowed to harvest eggs in some parts of the world, including Alaska. Those that are native and subsistently live are allowed to still collect eggs. But as you can imagine, it's not permissible to do on a commercial scale. The gill nets and the long lining, we are getting better at this worldwide. We have regulations, we have things that are in play where we have flags on the boats, flags on the line that flap in the wind, and they deter the birds from grabbing onto the bait, because the fisherman doesn't want to lose his or her bait to the bird. He wants it to sink, but oftentimes the birds were getting and diving down to the bait before it would sink. And in 1990, with black-footed albatross alone, there were 4,500 black-footed albatross that died because they grabbed onto the bait and they were killed by long lining. But we've come a long way since then, and methods have greatly improved. Pollution and oil spills, this is unfortunately just a fact of life with our our way of life and how we do things, and what we consume, and how we use energy. So the side effect of oil spills is going to be with us, and knock on wood, we don't have any major catastrophes in the upcoming future, but it's a dark face of reality that we need to be prepared for those sorts of things. And then human disturbance. This is a little more under our control, where we can model our behavior where we can enjoy these animals, but not disrupt their daily lives, and to be cognizant about what our actions and the effects of that are. So with disturbance, if this is a photo on the right-hand side, I'm just going to go back here. This is a photo of Flatiron Rock off of Trinidad. And there's not supposed to be, because it's under the protection of the California Coastal National Monument, there's not supposed to be any recreational drone flying over this rock. However, you can imagine if a drone were to fly over the rock, what types of predators do you think eat the common murre? Aerial predators like peregrine falcons or bald eagles, things that are coming from the air. So when you fly a drone over that, they're going to be looking up, and they're going to be watchful and wary, and they might even start to fly off the rock. And when they do that, or they move, then that's when they get exposed. These eggs get exposed, and then you have these other opportunistic predators, the neighbors, the western gulls, come in and eat the eggs. This could easily be common ravens. There are a lot of common ravens around Trinidad and coastal Humboldt County in general, unfortunately. So that brings us to talk about the North Coast Seabird Protection Network. And this was started back in 2016 with the BLM kind of spearheading this chapter. The Seabird Protection Network existed in other places of California, but we didn't have one here for the North Coast. And part of the impetus was that there were 2 oil spills back in the 90s, and these oil spills put aside an oil trust for studies to be done on seabirds, and to see how they fared after these oil spills, and to see if there's anything that we could do to stop that sort of thing happening in the future. So because of the ocean currents, we saw that the oil floated north into Trinidad, and Trinidad had large seabird colonies, and so that's where they focused their primary research sites. This is just a map of the bird colonies throughout the state. And as you can see, Northern California has a high percentage in terms of the rest of the state. There's the Farallon Islands, that about 24% of all of California's seabirds occur off the Farallon Islands off of San Francisco. And then in Northern California, we have about 22%. Of course, that includes Castle Rock up at Del Norte and Crescent City. So the North Coast Seabird Protection Network took a multifaceted approach, where they wanted to do population monitoring, and at the same time they wanted to alert people that there were these immense seabird colonies out there, and they also wanted to alert them to certain behaviors that they could do to keep the seabirds safe, but also do some ethical wildlife watching. So we recruited a bunch of community or participant scientists to collect data, and to also provide education for all the visitors that were in the area, alerting them to the seabird colonies nearby, the biology behind that, and things that they could do to be informed. If you're watching wildlife and the wildlife is watching you back, then they are on alert. So that's just something that we tell folks to kind of keep in the back of their mind, that if the animal sees you, then you know that you have just entered into their space, and they are on alert. So the more that we learn about these seabird colonies, the more that we can get a sense of how they're doing from year to year, the nesting success, the reproductive success, and even the roosting success of how they're using the rocks is important. So we have these data sheets, and we'll talk about that perhaps at the next presentation if folks want to come back and they want to sign up. But this is the data sheets. We also talk about pinnipeds, those are the sea lions and the seals, and then we count various rocks. So we also mark down disturbances where we see birds that get flushed or displaced, and sometimes hikers are hiking on the rocks, sometimes kayakers get too close, sometimes the US Coast Guard helicopter comes and buzzes the rock, whether they're doing their training or whether it's a real life mission. And so, you know, we are working every year with these groups, with the local kayak groups out of Trinidad, with the US Coast Guard, who have agreed to do their trainings on the off season, on the non-breeding wintertime for their vertical cliff face nesting. We're in partnership with a lot of different entities, state parks, Humboldt State, etc. And obviously the Trinidad Coastal Land Trust is a major player in these seabird surveys and in this program as a whole. We're involved in lots of different things. Godwit Days, if you haven't heard of that, as a local bird festival. aalge is education for after education, sort of lifelong learners. And then of course we're involved in elementary schools, grade schools, talking about the recreational fish day and 4th of July, we're down there, and various holidays, just trying to educate the public about the importance of you know, what a local treasure the seabird colonies of Trinidad are. So here are a lot of our partners for this. And with that, thanks for turning your video back on, Carol. With that, we can field some questions.
All right. Thanks, Russ. Really appreciate that. I learn something every time I hear you speak. So, and I'm just sort of a bird wonk anyway, so it's really cool to be impressed by all their adaptations. If you feel so inclined or comfortable and feel like turning on your video and have questions, or if you'd rather just submit them via the chat. I know we got one question earlier in the chat, Russ, about where puffins nested in the past. And you said they were more common in Trinidad.
Puffins were on, oddly enough, Puffin Rock. Oh. But they were also more common on Green Rock. And Green Rock, I can, yeah, somebody asked about.
Could you maybe stop sharing? Yeah, there you go, so that we can see folks if they want.
And yeah, Sherman wanted to know where Flatiron is on the map. Excuse me. And so while I'm getting that up, maybe you can read me the next question.
Yeah, let's see. When is nesting season for seabirds? Mark asks.
The nesting season for seabirds is typically April through August. In California, you know, the further south you go, the earlier in the year it will be, and the further north you go, the later in the year it will be. So I might just share this real fast.
Okay.
That being said, the Murres will come back, and folks may have noticed this. I think I'm going the wrong way. I'm sorry. The Murres will come back to the rock in January, and then they will see what's going on, and then they will come back in February, and they'll come back in March, and they'll go on and off the rock and on and off the rock. But nesting doesn't truly start until late March, early April. So on a map, isn't the greatest map, but this is Trinidad. If you can see my cursor, this is Trinidad here, and then this is Trinidad Head, of course. Trinidad Beach is here, and so Flatiron is, when you're at Trinidad Beach and you look straight out, it is a large flat rock. The other rocks to the north and south will be rounded, and this one is, kind of rectangular shaped, if you will. So is that fair to say?
Sounds good. And then I think you might see that there was a question about why the change in nesting behavior by the puffins from the past to now.
Yeah, we ate them all. No, to be honest, I don't know the answer to that. Puffins are one of those species that in the lower 48, they've never been a species that has bred in large densities. And one of the reasons is because they, like the Rhinocerous Auklet, they need a lot of soil on the rocks to dig their own burrows. And puffins, all three species of puffins dig their own burrows. So 5, 6, 7 feet down. So the soil on the rocks is a limiting factor.
Okay. Any other questions? Maybe while you're thinking of questions, I might just reiterate that the community science training does begin on March 23rd. Like Russ kind of gave you a little preview of the data sheets, but it's a really fun way to interact. If you like to go out along the Trinidad coast, there's like 8 different monitoring locations, and collect the data on a data sheet, and then it gets entered into a database by Point Blue, which is an organization that helps organize data and can actually analyze and summarize the data. I was just alerted that they're developing a method where you can enter that data via your cell phone. So I'm kind of curious how that's going to work. So I'll be chatting with them, and it might be a new innovation that makes it even easier, hopefully. But you don't have to have any previous birding experience. We've had great volunteers who just came and learned about the species that we're focused on. So we'll give you training. You have to come up to Trinidad to check out a spotting scope. So you don't need your own spotting scope. And we have a way of keeping that safe, and you can check that out and sign up, and we'll give you all the details. And the place to find how to sign up is on our website. If you go to trinidadcoastallandtrust.org and you just go to programs under community scientists, you'll see a registration form there. Ooh, we have some more puffin questions. How do puffins dig 6-foot burrows?
They use their bill. They will use their bill, and they will kind of move it back and forth to kick that loose soil, and then they'll kind of move forward, and then with their feet they will kick it out behind them, and thus just kind of doing that over and over again. So this does, there's a funny story that has nothing to do with this, but it's about puffin. And I was walking in downtown Anchorage, and there was a puffin inn, and they had this emblem of a puffin up there. And I looked up there and I was like, that is an Atlantic puffin. And for those of you that don't know, Atlantic puffins don't live in Alaska. They live on the Atlantic coast, and the horned puffin and the tufted puffin live in Alaska. So I went in and I told the manager. He was not impressed. He's like, what am I going to do? So
I wondered how that worked out.
yeah.
There's Atlantic puffin in Cannon Beach, Oregon. How interesting.
Oh goodness.
I have a question for you. Russ, you described how the Murres right now, and I've shared that I've seen them come back to the rocks, and they'll be making all a ruckus or be floating in big groups on the ocean. And I was all excited, and I went to take my husband to see it and they were gone. So they obviously come and go, come and go. So how do they find their mates? Do they have any mate fidelity, or do they just pick a new mate each time? Or can you say a little
They
bit about that?
they do have mate fidelity. I mean, divorces happens, it's uncommon, but especially in the bird world, it seems like the longer lived species, and common murres live in their late 20s. So the larger puffins and Rhinocerous Auklet and common murres are usually in their late 20s is kind of their end time. And it makes sense to have a high mate fidelity when you're living that long, and they only produce one chick, one egg per year. So again, that reproductive strategy, if you will, is what they use. Not so in other birds that are shorter lived, but yeah.
And how do they find each other in that mess of birds?
Well, typically, so that's kind of a two-pronged question, but what will happen is they typically find each other by sound, oddly enough. And in common murres, they have this interesting breeding biology where obviously the female lays the egg and is on the egg, and then the male comes in, and then after a time, then both parents will start going out to fish and come in, and then at some point the female leaves and goes out to sea, and the male continues to rear the chick. So the chick, after it gets to a certain age, will jump off the rock, and the dad will go down to the water and be calling for it, jump to me. And so then that chick will jump down off the rock and then make it safely, in our Disneyland ending, to the dad, and then the dad will continue to feed it. And you can, in the fall, often people take boat trips in the fall, August, September, October, to go watch birds out on the ocean, and you can hear the chick begging, and you can hear the dad calling. So it's sort of interesting as you go out, you're like, oh, there's a murre chick, oh yeah, there's the dad, and they're kind of feeding together. And anyway,
nice, I love it. Any other questions for folks? Feel free to jump in. You can turn on your video if you want to say hi, or anyway, I just want to say that this partnership, this couldn't be possible without the partnership and support from the BLM. So the Trinidad Coastal Land Trust really, really appreciates this. And even if you're not sure about going out and doing the surveys and actually signing up to be a seabird monitor, we also have used folks who've gone through the training who help with our outreach. It's really fun to be out on the 4th of July spotting scopes, and it's actually been a COVID friendly way to be outdoors, and people drop by the station and learn a little bit about some of the really common birds that are out there. It's as much fun for me to be interacting with the public as well. And so we'll continue to do, Russ and others have helped with seabird walks and birding walks. And like I mentioned, we'll have a bilingual birding walk coming up soon. And so if you want to be kind of in the know about what's happening with the Land Trust, you can go to our website and you can sign up for our e-newsletter that comes out once a month. And we are a local nonprofit, and we manage or own over 26 different properties in the Trinidad area. So this has been a really great fit for us, because that conservation would not be possible without people really learning about and learning to love the resources, the rocks, and all the wildlife that depend on them. So I don't see any other questions in the chat.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I know that you didn't have to, so yeah, thanks, and lovely to be able to speak from afar virtually. It was a treat.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a good evening, and hopefully we'll see you at some future programs. All right. Bye-bye.